Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming.
We got to get out there, right?
Thank you so much for coming to the Town Green field trip with Russ Hopping.
We got time for that.
I'm Town Green's Executive Director, Maureen Aylward, and we love doing field trips. It gives us a chance to come together to have an educational experience with an expert, and we have Russ Hopping with us from the Trustees, which we're thrilled about. And again, it gives us a chance to learn about climate impacts on our area, in our region. And today's field trip that Russ will explain for just a moment, we're hoping to take a look at climate adaptation in this area. So, Russ.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and it's a pleasure to be here. And we certainly picked the right day, right? It feels more like April, late April, than it does March, mid-March. So, yes, I'm going to just explain a little bit about salt marsh history and the Great Marsh that surrounds us here, and the restoration techniques that we're going to be looking at, that the Trustees and its partners have been implementing for a few years now. Leave all this behind, but it's going to be fun to get out there and actually see the work that's been done and how in the impact that it is having. We started this work about, I don't know, in 2016. We realized that it would be beneficial for the Trustees to take a look at the impact of the projected sea level rise as a result of climate change, climate warming, and what impacts it may have on not only our ecological resources, but access and our cultural resources along the coast. And no surprise, I guess, but came back with, one of the areas that's probably going to change the most is our salt marshes. And in this case here at the Great Marsh, we're looking at a 25,000 acre ecosystem that includes the salt marshes, the barrier beaches, so Crane Beach, Plum Island, etc. There is a relationship there, right? If you don't have the barriers, you don't have the salt marsh. And then the tidal waters and mud flats in between. That whole thing is kind of functioning as one. That's the Great Marsh ecosystem. So we started thinking about, well, what is the condition of our marshes? Prior to that, we really didn't do much with salt marshes. We just thought, yep, they're green, they're there, they're doing great. Not a lot of recreation out there, and our priorities are elsewhere, such as piping plovers, for example, on the beach. Well, lo and behold, turns out they weren't doing as well as we thought they were, and we began to look around to think about, well, what, if any, intervention can we do to make these salt marshes more resilient to what's coming? So in a way, it's already happening, and we're going to see some of that when we go out there. But the models are projecting it's going to get a lot worse. What's getting worse? Sea level rise is going to get higher and probably at a faster rate. The whole trick to this whole restoration is how can we intervene to make the marshes most resilient to be able to keep pace with that sea level rise before they get overtaken. So that's what we're going to talk about today. I'm just going to have these lovely people demonstrate some of the techniques and a little bit of the history that sets the stage for why we need to do restoration in the first place. So first of all, Jim, what Jim is holding is just a very kind of big picture to set the stage for one. On the left is the Great Marsh in concept anyway. So that's that 25,000 acre ecosystem, just showing you the barrier islands, the salt marsh, etc. That is the scale we would like to work at. So not a few acres here, a few acres there. That's the vision that we see, this whole ecosystem. The other map there is just simply highlighting some of the protected land, the orange being the Trustees, purple Mass Wildlife, and I believe green is Essex County Greenbelt, and some federal and state land there. So those are prioritizing the areas for our third phase. You see all these tracks written here. There's 19 tracks. So all those areas outlined in blue is our phase 3. But that's the scale, again, that we're working at. We have 3 phases to this. Phase 1 was done at Old Town Hill in Newbury. That was 85 acres. That was the first project we started on. Phase 2 includes land on Mass Wildlife Marsh up at Bill Forward Wildlife Management Area, William Forward up in Newbury, and then 132 acres here on either side of Argilla Road, which we're going to walk down to, and then 111 acres nearby over in Essex. So that's the phase 2, and then phase 3 is about just over 1,000 acres. So the goal was scale up as much as we can. You get a lot more impact, obviously, with the larger the project, and you lower those costs. And we can talk a little bit more about those later on. So even though these are the trustees-led projects, we're doing this in conjunction with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service over at Parker River National Wildlife Refuge, Mass Wildlife. They're the second largest marsh owner, Trustees, and then Essex County Greenbelt, which is the third largest marsh owner in the Great Marsh ecosystem. Those 4 organizations, if you will, own and protect 50% of the Great Marsh. So it's about 8,000 acres. So that was our initial scale with the partners. We said, well, we can at least begin to think about this at an 8,000 acre scale. We certainly want to go beyond that. So thank you, Jim. You don't need to hold that any longer. I'm going to take this and just share it. Is this good to have it in front of the camera here? Okay. But what this is the actual restoration plan for the 132 acres here. And I can pass this around as well. But what you're looking at here, so the outline in white is the actual 132 acres. Then the red lines are the old agricultural embankments that the farmers created. The green and the blue lines are those ditches that the farmers then made as well, together with the embankments. And I'm going to pass this around. I'll start there. So, starting in the 1600s, certainly throughout the 1700s, and then through the 1800s, the farmers manipulated and altered all the salt marsh pretty much, not just the Great Marsh in Massachusetts, but certainly here. We're not finding any areas that haven't been altered at this point. But what they did is they wanted to increase agricultural productivity, so they started to drain the marsh so it would drain faster, if you will, and then they would put up these embankments or berms that would eventually keep the tides from actually flooding certain areas of the marsh. And those ditches would drain surface water, groundwater, any flood tides that might get over it, through that system, out through those embankments, and they were able to increase agricultural productivity, sometimes by 3 times as much. So if you can imagine, 1 ton of hay, salt marsh hay off of an acre, once they were able to do all these agricultural alterations, they were able to get up to 3 tons. Right? So that's valuable. I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. Along comes the internal combustion engine. You really don't need all that fodder and bedding. You get 1 crop off the marsh a year where the uplands had already all been cleared. You can get 2 to 3 crops off of upland hay. So the first thing to go when there was not much demand for hay anymore was the salt marshes. Farmers walked away from all that infrastructure. They didn't do anything to it. Prior to that, they were keeping that infrastructure up every single time they were out there, right? Clear this ditch, fix that, tide gate, that kind of thing. It was worth it to them. So then what happened is all that fell apart. The system began to fall apart, began to hold a lot of water. That's when it got known as, marshes aren't good for anything but breeding all these salt marsh mosquitoes, right? There was a lot of water on there. Then came along WPA programs, Works Project Association or administration, I guess. But then also mosquito control to drain off all that ponding water that was happening as a result of that, farmers walking away from that infrastructure. Fast forward a few decades, here we are, right? The marsh is going through something similar. And I'm going to show you 2 things. So let me see. I will take this one first. So 2 things are happening. So farmers created a lot more ditches per acre, so to speak, than there would have been natural creeks. In doing so, anytime you expose peat, which is what the marsh is built on, and it's not flooded, it's exposed to air. So once air gets to it, it starts that decomposition process. Salt marsh peat is made up to 80% undecomposed organic material. It's the plants. All those salt marsh grasses out there have to grow every single year. That's a lot of material. Then it dies, and then new vegetation grows every year. And then together with some incoming sediment, all of that material is sequestered away from oxygen, and it helps build the marsh. Once you dig a ditch through it, you expose it to oxygen, you start that decomposition process. It doesn't build either as much, or it actually subsides. It's going in the wrong direction when we have sea level. The second thing that's happening is where all of those ditches are getting clogged, the water is staying on the marsh. And then you're seeing the groundwater in that marsh come up to the surface. When it sits at the surface or just below, it kills off all the marsh grass. Those are wetland plants that are adapted to a tidal cycle. They're not aquatic plants. They do not want to grow in standing water. As a result, they die. You lose that biomass. The marsh sinks in those places. So in both trajectories, you're losing elevation and gain when we're actually when we need the opposite. We need to have the marsh be building as much as possible to keep up with sea level rise. What's the solution? So, several things. Ditches, we're remediating through what we call ditch remediation, and this is harvesting salt marsh grass next to the ditches we are remediating. Again, all of the the green lines on that map are the ditches we will remediate. The blue lines are the ditches we're leaving. We can't get rid of all the ditches because the marsh needs to flood and drain, right? Normally there would have been all these little creeks. Those creeks are gone. The farmers got rid of them all. They filled them in and created all those straight lines. We're not trying to recreate all those natural sinuous creeks. We're using the existing infrastructure to replicate the natural process that a marsh would have in terms of flooding and draining. So this is a representation of that. Over a 3-year period, the hay is cut, moved into the ditch, pushed down in, secured with twine and wooden stakes. And it just needs to be secured long enough for a couple weeks, really, for it to get wet enough and compacted enough. Every incoming tide, twice a day, is bringing in sediment that's suspended in that water. As it flows through these ditches over that grass, that sediment drops out and starts to fill in all that space in between the salt marsh hay. We're essentially trying to rebuild the marsh peat that was there as fast as we can, using the same ingredients, if you will, that would normally do it. So the average ditch takes about 3 years. So we have to do it over a 3-year period. You're going to see the results of 2 years of this treatment when we go out there.
Russ, do I understand that the roots of your peat can run 30 to 50 feet deep?
No. A prairie, maybe. Out here, most of the roots are growing within the first 10 centimeters. So you lined me up perfectly for my next. So so where the water is staying on the marsh, and let me just back up. The reason we're not, in addition to what I said about why we're not treating all of the ditches, is the remaining ditches, they'll serve as what we're calling primary or single channel hydrology. And by closing up the other ones or healing them, the water that would have been going through those now has to go through the remaining ditches. And what that does is it forces the sediment that's dropping out and clogging all these ditches to now be forced through that ditch, and on the most extreme tides, mostly storm tides, it's flushing it out onto the marsh surface where it is needed to build that elevation. And that's exactly how a natural marsh would have worked. So where those clogs occur, and we're seeing this happen on lots of the marsh. I mean, it's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of acres. We need to facilitate the draining of that marsh, the water off of the surface, and lower the groundwater down below 10 centimeters to turn back on the optimum growing condition for the marsh grasses. Once we can do that, you now have the basic building block, again, producing all that organic material that creates the peat. And then it also, when the marsh floods, you have grass that can slow down that flood water and trap the sediment. So it's all about the grass in this case.
Is that helping with carbon sequestration in the marsh?
Yes. So question being is, does it help with carbon sequestration? So that peat, that 80% undecomposed organic matter, that's all carbon. So marshes can sequester up to 10 times more carbon than a forest can. It's almost similar to the tundra. I think I have this right, where there's a lot of carbon up in the tundra, but it's all locked away because it's in permafrost. As the globe warms, it's not permafrost anymore. You expose it, the surface, oxygen is able to penetrate, and you're seeing rapid release of carbon in the tundra. It's a very similar scenario. We have 45,000 acres of salt marsh in Mass, so that's a lot of carbon, and we're losing it pretty fast. And some people would ask me, well, won't sea level rise create more salt marsh as the sea level rise? Well, it will, but the topography here is such that you're going to lose far more than you will gain. It's not like further south on the coastal plain where it just goes in for miles and miles and miles. You hardly have any gain. Here you can have, and we'll see it out there, our islands, they abruptly come up out of the marsh. That's because a lot of these islands around here are drowned drumlins. It's the tops of the drumlins, and the marsh has developed in between. So we don't have that advantage they do down south. That's a good thing in some ways, but we're gonna see very little marsh created compared to what we have as a result of marsh migration. So with that, we're going to go out on the marsh. You've heard me enough right now, and it's too nice. Yeah, we got a car coming through here.
Yep. Let's break for now. Pause.
But while we're waiting, if anybody's got any questions about what I just did. Yes?
This shows phase 2. That's underway, completed.
Right.
And phase 3 is obviously in a different way.
Yeah, so phase 1, it's typically a 3-year process. Phase 1, we finished a year ago, and we've actually, in 2023 was year 4. We did some spot treatments where some of those ditches they had some spaces we still needed to get, elevated. Phase 2, we completed the 2nd year of ditch remediation last fall. Phase 3 is not started yet. We're about to start the permitting process. They may need a little more room to get out. So I'm going to leave these behind, because if we get any breeze out there, I'll blow away with them. Thank you, guys. That's very nice. You have a second career, I can tell.
Third career. Fourth.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, right. All right, well, let's walk down and get into it and see this stuff.
When are you starting up this spring?
When we get permit. Oh, you mean for phase 2? Well, as soon as Jeff gets a window.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. And then phase 3, God, I hope, Peter, I hope it's early 2025.
So frustrating. I think this new regulations that they're putting out are worse. I mean, they're allowing pilots and stuff like that, but they're but so small. I mean, they're talking about like 100 square foot or something like
1,000 square feet.
Yeah, what are you going to do with that?
I don't know.
I
I made the point at multiple meetings. I'm like, that's a great start, but.
Yeah.
Yep.
But I know, and the monitoring that's required and everything else. I think it's
Mary put a
just
good
massive.
letter together.
Yeah.
I had a chance to look at it earlier today.
When are they going to come out with a final? Do you know?
They should be submitting the next draft for public review very soon.
Yeah.
I'm going to say a couple weeks.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's kind of what they implied.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, will Jeff ever harvest rack
No. I haven't seen him do that or heard him ask to do it.
or dead grass? Any of the the grass that's laying over? Can he get that and put it in?
Well, if the dead grass, if it's part of what he mows, yes.
No, I mean, but like right now, go out.
Yes, he could go out now and do it. Yeah.
So that's what he'll do.
He can, if he's on the right cycle that he needs to do some catch up maybe,
Yeah.
he can do that. He can come out and do
Get the
this
dead
now.
stuff,
Yes.
yeah.
Oh yeah. Doesn't matter if it's dead or alive,
Right,
you know.
I just didn't know
I mean,
if
that
it was-
stuff's got some good longevity to it.
Yeah, I just didn't know if it was capable of harvesting the dead stuff.
He
That's
is.
the way- Yeah. Okay.
Yep. He is.
You know what? We've been mapping rack. The rack that washes up alternate floor that's dead and washes up like
Yeah, we end up over here. We end up with a ton of
all
it.
along here. We map it along there, and Salisbury. There's a ton
The
of places.
Warrens have a spot over by them where it's
Yep.
just acres and
Yep.
acres of it.
And some of it is transient. You know, it comes and then a couple
Right.
of months later it goes away.
Right.
But
Just
some
want to
of
make a reflection here. I just want to point out that is no reflection of our budget.
But so what we've been finding
Just needs new tires, right?
what we've been finding is that the reason there's more rack, and rack smothers the marsh. You
Oh,
see it,
yes. Oh, yeah.
And what we've been finding is that because of sea level rise, you're getting more areas where alternate flora grows, and so you're getting more rack.
Yeah, I don't doubt that. That makes
Yeah.
sense. That makes
Yeah.
sense.
And so you're getting more smothered marsh.
Right. Just going to point out as we walk along here, you see these nice changes in vegetation out there, these nice long rectangular panels. That is where we have done the harvest of the grass to create hay to put into those ditches. So you can actually see this, and then in a couple of months, you won't be able to see that. Yeah. It's a good time to see kind of that impact.
Right. Do you have your own equipment that does the harvesting of the hay?
No.
Are you using Jeff's?
Yep. Yeah, we contract out all that work.
Okay, yeah. Green crab stuff.
Yeah, I'll go around to different markets.
It's so much easier.
Let these guys go.
It's more involved in chitin, in the use of chitin.
We picked a good day. Better than yesterday. That was going to be the day.
Yeah, really.
And we have a huge supply of green crabs with lots of chitin. And going across so we might be,
Yeah, we're going to go down. We're actually going to walk out Patterson Island Road, I think. I'm going to go easy on you guys today. Yeah. I mean, there's so many places I'd like to bring you to, but it will take us all day to get there. It would be an adventure, which I love. I know you guys are up for it, but
Well, you got to prepare us for that.
I don't want to. If we could walk on this side, we got a car coming out. Yes.
What's the impact of invasives like Phragmites on this effort that you're doing?
Yeah, that's a very complicated question.
Of course it is.
Right now, I got to tell you, for us in where we're working, it's not a big factor. There's a lot of reasons for that. So the short answer is, for us right now, not a lot. We are monitoring for if frag is coming into any of our work.
I wondered if that knowing
Yes.
how once it takes hold, it spreads so easily.
Yes. We'll hold up here, and they got a car coming in. We're just going to cross here, walk up the road a little bit, and go out. It's Patterson Island Road.
Which I've never heard of,
Okay.
and I've never been on. But are those houses that you always see?
No, Patterson Island's right there. It's that third island out.
Oh.
So this is what the clammers use.
Oh.
Yeah. Nor am I. Just be careful. Cars come around this corner pretty fast. John, you don't mind we go out there, do you? I didn't think so. Yeah, there's Donnie. Been working on the property good portion of his life. Can tell you stories. Oh, this is nice. They mowed this spring. At least they pushed it back some. I think there's always been a little bit here, but
I saw your, I think you did a story on Chronicle about the old Tonto.
oh god, that was like 2 years ago, maybe. Yeah. What was her name?
I don't remember who that reporter was, but I just
Oh, what's her name?
fascinating.
She's really short. I was like amazed.
What was it, Erica Carrington?
Erica, yes, thank you.
Yes.
Erica.
What was the story on? Chronicle did it.
Same thing, but
The project that they've been doing at Old Town Hill.
all right, this is better than the road. Hey, John, do you know the history of this road? Because I don't. I just know the shell fishing community uses it.
All I know is that whoever the steward of this property granted access to the clammers. So,
But this is yours right here, right?
This is our,
Yeah.
We own this. Yeah.
Okay.
I have deeds that have dates in the 1800s that have this road for clammers.
Yeah. And then what? Does your line end at those big telephone poles?
Yeah.
Okay.
Should point out what's going on.
Yeah. It's. Has this been flooding the last couple of days?
Yeah.
It has. Okay.
But what I've noticed is moving towards upland.
No, it's going in the right direction.
Going in the wrong direction.
Oh, you guys are still safe. You got quite an elevation gain there. But imagine if that marsh wasn't there. Right. I see Essex is doing its hazard update on its hazard mitigation plan. I can't go, but Peter's going to go. Any day now.
What are you seeing that's interesting in terms of avian life these days?
Right now?
Yeah.
I saw the other day, I saw a lot of wood ducks, grackles, blackbirds, kingfishers. They all kind of came in. Yeah. We're just going to hold up here for a second. Sorry. It's a couple extra steps today. You won't have to walk as far tomorrow, right?
Are bird watchers allowed to come up here?
This road, no.
No.
No, this is pretty much exclusive for the first part of it is private property, unless you have, and then the trustees from here on out, but it's really for the clammers. You can see one of the guys way out there. So what they do is they park on this last island. There's a boat ramp there that they can get into with their boats, or they walk out across the marsh. It's got to be a couple thousand feet, and they usually behind like a child's snow sled, and that's what they have their bushels, in that they collect the soft shell clams, they fill up the bushels, and they pull them back. So they're working hard for those soft shell clams.
Yes.
I learned something new about our clammers.
Russ,
Yeah.
also mentioned to people, you mentioned how marsh migration isn't really that significant, particularly up in here. If you look around at all the edges of the marsh, you see how steep it is. And, what are you going to get? Even if you raise the water 2 feet, you might pick up another 5 feet of marsh on the edge anywhere. There's not a lot of place for the marsh to migrate.
No. Well, I think you said it.
Yeah.
But that's absolutely right. You can see, you have to get up to, even if you could get 10 feet of sea level rise, which we don't want, you're not going to see an equal amount of salt marsh created for what gets lost. I just wanted to point out, here's your classic ditch, right? Straight. Mother Nature does not make things in straight lines typically. And this a mosquito. I grew up thinking it's really not. It's this history of how this all put into agricultural production. And then if you turn over here, you'll see, well, look, there's another ditch right there, but that's full of water, right? But the tide's much lower. You look in this ditch and you can see, well, the tide's a couple feet down. There's an example of where one of these has clogged. The water is being held on the marsh over till the next cycle again. And it will stay there for, well, John, that probably doesn't go away, does it?
Doesn't go away.
Yeah, doesn't go away. That pretty much stays there. So what happens is then that means that the groundwater around that is at that equal height, right? So it's not far below, and as you can see right in front of it here, this whole marsh in front of us, it's got standing water on it. So you got nice Paytens grass here. This is what they wanted to harvest. And then you immediately walk into this. There's a couple inches of water on this. This is the short form alterniflora. So this is the grass that grows typically along the creeks, can get 6 feet high. That's when it's under this daily regime of flooding and draining, flooding and draining. But when it stays saturated, you end up with this super short form of it. And because it can tolerate greater wetness than these other grasses. Millimeters matter out here. And eventually, if this didn't drain, this grass dies off and you end up with essentially a mud flat, and then it sinks in elevation. Not good.
This whole region headed towards a big mud flat.
Yeah. So John lives right there, and he's been watching this happen in real time.
Oh, no kidding.
Yep.
So is this one of your top priority zones?
This is phase 2 on that side, all the way to the beach, out to Castle Neck River. This is part of phase 3. So I keep telling John in 2025 he's going to see a lot of activity happening around this.
Is that why this side is more saturated than this side?
Perhaps. I'd love to take credit for that right now. Probably not.
Okay.
It doesn't really happen that fast. I like to say we're moving at the speed of nature. It took hundreds of years to get our marshes into this situation. We can't reverse it overnight. When you try to do things that fast in this system, others have found it just doesn't work. So we're trying to do it as fast as we can without adding additional damage and impact.
Russ, do you mind if I interject?
Not at all, please.
Stage?
No.
But not that many years ago, when sea level rise wasn't as great, the sea level was not getting up onto the marsh quite as frequently. So some of this area would drain. Even if it was plugged, it would drain a little bit. The water would go down, and you wouldn't see standing water like this quite so much. But in recent years, as sea level, and when I say recent, probably within the last 10 years, you're starting to see more and more of the marsh get saturated. And as Russ said earlier, the saturated marsh, this grass does not grow in it. Right now, it's converted over to a short form alterniflora. Alterniflora likes to be underwater at least twice a day.
Yep.
It can handle a little bit more than that, but this will soon change. And what you start to see is die-off areas, where it's most saturated, and those die-off areas will start to coalesce, and you'll turn into a mud flat, and eventually into a pan or a pool. These big water ponds on the marsh, and that will start to take over the entire marsh. But this is a fairly recent phenomenon as far as the extent of what's happening here.
I'm sorry, is this a product then of groundwater infiltration, saltwater infiltration into groundwater from sea level rise?
It's mostly, so the question is, are we seeing this infiltration or increase in groundwater coming up to the surface? In this case, if you look just beyond where that standing water is, my eye tells me you got a drop there. So that no. Yeah, you want to see me disappear. And if we did walk over there, what you would find is there is an obstruction there, and it appears to be an old roadway. So there was something altered there to provide passage, probably for carts, horse and cart. Could be an embankment. It's one of those things, or both. And just on the other side of it, you have a free-flowing creek. So the water's being held up here, and this let's call this this pan, if you will, is where the water isn't able to drain out fast enough before the next tide. So you have an elevated groundwater that's expressing itself at the surface here more often than not, than just the other side of where that obstruction is. So it's a localized increase in groundwater at the surface. Yep. We can fix that. And we are. So, all right, well, let's keep going. Watch, I walked through here and I was getting stuck, so you may want to stay on that side. Yeah.
Pardon me if you already answered this, I got distracted there. What were the agricultural products that came out of here?
Salt marsh hay was the biggest.
Okay.
This stuff right here.
And how did that work out economically, and where does it stand now as a product?
It's not done very much at all anymore.
Okay.
Yeah, it's still happening in the Great Marsh. There are still a couple of people who do it. Okay. You go to your garden center.
Occasionally you see the garden
Yeah, and the reason it's being sold, people love it because we're going to stop right here. You can put it as a mulch in your garden, but all the seeds that are in it are from salt marsh plants that won't germinate in your garden. So, yeah, right? I mean, brilliant. Okay, this is where we get to get our feet wet. We're going to go out here along the edge to where you see some of these stakes out there. This is where it gets fun. Did you see the sunset last night? It was beautiful at my house. I don't think we'll be out here that late.
Are there any other crops possible, you think?
Yes, there were. I'm the wrong guy to talk about this, but
Is that a Peter question?
yeah.
Is there a seasonality to this work? Do you only do it in warm weather months or year round?
Good question. So don't let me forget that.
Okay.
It's like when I do birding trips, right? It's like, guys, by the time you get here, you miss the bird, right? That's when I know who's really there for the birding. So I was asked the question, what was the main crop, agricultural crop, and that was salt marsh hay. It's essentially what you guys are standing in. But then, were there other salt crops that were done? Yes, there were. I know a little bit about this. I know a little bit to get myself in trouble. So what you frequently will see, you don't see it here, but in a lot of the marsh, you may see, all of a sudden, you see an old fence line. Maybe it's way out here, right? And you look at the upland, and there's a field on the other side. So what they would do is they could manage the marsh to where it was dry enough that the highest part of the marsh would get incorporated into the upland hay or whatever the crop was. That wasn't always fresh hay. But there was there's a root vegetable called a mangel wurzel. It's essentially, God, is it a beet, Peter? Maybe you remember. Is it a beet, a turnip, something like that?
It's like a beet.
Yes, it's like a beet. It's actually, you can find it now. There's some people that are trying to get it back. But it was tolerant of the semi-saturated, lightly, salted areas, and it was a good fodder for livestock. So it was another way. So they weren't growing just salt marsh hay, but again, the market just, those things fell out of favor.
Do you know if they ever tried to take advantage of asparagus growing in this environment and try to cultivate that?
So if any of you didn't hear that, the question, did they try to grow asparagus? I do not know, but I do find wild asparagus along the upland edge. Not uncommon. So it's possible. All right, we're almost there. Follow me. I'm sure they did. I mean, when it was an agricultural economy, I'm sure they were trying everything. Right? We would too.
This is all going to be panned,
Well, this is Ronald.
Yeah.
All right, you're going to start noticing a little squishiness. Trying to avoid the ditch so that people don't fall into it. Oh yeah, there's ones you can't see here. The vegetation's growing over the top. All right, so I'm going to stop us here, wait for the group to catch up. Going to hold you up right there.
Okay.
I don't want anyone falling in.
Which way are you speaking about? Right there?
We'll find out. You want to back up just a little? Keep going, keep going.
Appreciate it.
All right, so I am standing on a ditch. If you look down there, I'm directly in line with that long ditch, right? And you can see if you look down that ditch. So this section here, where about where that stake is, it's completely remediated on its own. There may be an open, it may just be covered over. So that ditch may still be functioning underneath an amount of surface covering of peat and grass. We're finding that all over the place out here. Call them zombie ditches. Right? Good name. They also come in from other directions. The vegetation sometimes is a really good clue. But if you look down that ditch, so beyond where the stake is, you'll see it's full of water, and then it gets to a slightly elevated area, right? That's an embankment. Then it gets past that embankment, and it drops way down, totally different elevation. The water that's in it is another like 2 feet below that. You're looking at the tiered system, which all of the salt marsh was. So lower down, then there was an embankment. So that first part of that ditch meets the creek that's out there. Then it comes up, meets an embankment. Then it comes up again to where that stake is. That was another embankment. And I guarantee, well, I don't know if there was another embankment in between here and there, but they were managing all three of those tiers slightly differently. It's all because the elevation of the marsh and the hydrology. And they were maintaining all of this. So what we're going to do is we're going to go out towards that center stake, but I'd like to avoid this ditch, which doesn't look like it exists there, but as you get out towards that stake, I've had people fall in.
Are zombie ditches good or bad?
Neither, but we have to be aware of them when we're doing restoration.
They function like a ditch.
Yeah. So they're not any different really than the ones that we can see. It's just an earlier age of agriculture, and they've had more time, the marsh has had more time to heal over it. But lots of times there's still, essentially it's a pipe that's still allowing water to flow through the marsh. So we're going to circle around this way.
How far out from Upland Edge have you seen the effects of the farming? Like, I mean, if you go over towards the Castleneck Creek, you're, quarter, half mile away from Upland. Were they that far out?
Oh, they were still haying that.
They were right
Oh,
out there.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, from what I've been able to understand from Sue and what I've seen out here, it's like,
Way,
yeah,
way
the
out.
whole thing.
Yeah.
Right. So what I want to point out here is this indicates where we're monitoring sediment accretion. So, right, so you have a marsh elevation. We could put up, get surveyors out here and say, yep, this marsh right here is at such and such elevation. And then you got sea level rise. So what we're monitoring here, though, is how much accretion is happening on an annual basis. And then, but with subsidence, you would think it would match elevation, but it can subside at the same time the marsh is accreting. So we want to make sure that at the end of the day, at the end of whatever cycle we're in, long term, this marsh is taking advantage of that accretion and building in elevation and not just staying static or only accreting 1 millimeter a year with subsidence when it could be doing 3 to 4 millimeters a year without subsidence. And the way for us to do that is to get the water off of this marsh. So and I'll just explain what's happening here is there's a feldspar marker under there, so the mineral feldspar, it's laid on the surface, and then that maintains its integrity over time, and each year somebody comes back. We've contracted this work out with UNH. They come back and they cut out a triangle, and they lift it out, and then they can measure the amount of material that's on top of the feldspar layer. So we get an indication of how much accretion is happening. We also survey these to know what the elevation is, so we know we have a positive gain. So that's pretty cool.
Subsidence is again?
Yeah, so subsidence is the opposite of accretion. So we want the marsh to keep pace. 3 to 4 millimeters a year is what's happening now. So as long as the marsh does that 3 to 4 millimeters a year, as it's accreting, right? As it builds up, it's keeping pace with sea level rise. So the opposite is when the marsh is subsiding, it's decreasing in elevation. And the two reasons for that, again, are when you expose the peat with a ditch to air, everything around that, the air is able to penetrate feet into meters sometimes into it. The longer it's exposed over a tidal period, the further the air is allowed to get in. The organic material decomposes. And you have less organic material, you lose elevation. The other thing happens is when what we're dealing with here, this is a runnel. So from right here to that last stake, a machine came in and created that runnel or ditch, a shallow ditch. And what it's doing is draining off that groundwater or surface water at least down 10 centimeters. We want that again to be, well, it can be exposed to water occasionally through tides, but we want it to be short periods instead of staying here and creating saturated conditions, which kills off the vegetation, right? All this. When you do that, all the roots die. You lose elevation again like that. You subside. You lose that elevation. It's going in the wrong direction. So this runnel is taking off. This was all kind of one big pool. If we didn't put this runnel in, this would get deeper and deeper and keep expanding until it meets another, barrier. It could be the upland. It could be an embankment that's hard to see, but it's only 2 centimeters high. They're all over the place out here. And again, that's why I was showing you. You look down this, you can see that embankment right there. Just on the other side, the ditch gets way deeper and it goes out all the way to the creek.
That's an artificially created.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Yep.
So these would be like perfectly level if they weren't altered by trees?
Maybe not perfectly, but more level than they are right now. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. I mean, they knew intimately how this system worked. They were out here all the time. Well, maybe not all the time, but seasonally they were out here anyways. And they maintained all this. And then they would have these wooden tide gates that would allow water to flow out, the groundwater that's seeping out, or when you get, these precipitation events. So they were tending, this as if it was, it's their cropland.
Approximately when did that stop,
Early 1900s. Yep. Kind of what we can tell anyways, what others have instructed me on is, the peak of this development was in the late 1800s, where whole companies would come in and transform a landowner's marsh with bigger embankments, more, larger, more updated technology, if you will, the tide gates that go through those, they would re-ditch. Yeah, it was a business. So what we're trying to do is take advantage of that same concept, but in reverse. Bring crews back out here, so and just do the reverse. Yep. So. Yeah, you're talking about the vegetation. That's mostly algae. Oh, animals. Peter's right. You'd get the mummy chugs. Those are the little fish. Incredible little guys. First fish to go into space. Fun fact, right? Well, so the reason why that's interesting to me as an ecologist is, why would you send a fish like that into space? Well, would you guys say this is a pretty mild, gentle environment or a pretty tough environment? Tough, exactly. So you've got winter temperatures, right? It floods twice a day. It gets storms. In the summertime, if you came out here and you took the temperature of one of these pools, it's 100 degrees, like Peter says. I mean, and these fish can do that. They can survive in very low oxygenated water, high temperatures, freezing cold water, rich in oxygen. They can get marooned up here for weeks at a time, and then the tide comes back in. They are tough critters, so that's one reason why.
Where do they go after this?
They're down in the estuary. Yep.
Are they food in the food chain?
You bet. Yep, you bet.
There would fill
tide pools. And all the
Yep.
shorebirds are out.
So when you see terns out here foraging in these pools and creeks in the summertime, they're probably after mummy chugs and silver sides. It's another, similar looking fish. I've been seeing kingfishers come back this past week. They're hanging out in salt marshes. I'm sure they're after mummy chugs. Yep. And then there's always a bigger fish, I've heard. So, and there's always something to eat the bigger fish. So on and on. It's the base of the food chain. I don't know what's growing. You guys may know. Jim, do you know what's growing out here, Peter?
As far as
I'm not an algae person, so I'm sorry, I can't tell you. Yep. That's the white stuff on here, is bacteria.
700 species of bacteria. A lot. But there's a white film usually in the body of which is one of the bacteria.
Yep. It's very sulfuric, and that's why you smell that smell at low tide, like rotten eggs. It's a lot of sulfur in a salt marsh system, but the chemistry of it all has eluded me. I just haven't invested that much time. So, anyways, this is our photo monitoring point. So once a month, somebody will come out here, stand there, and take a picture. And I can tell you, after 2 years, this was dug in late winter 2022. So it's had a full 2 years now at this point. I think I'm doing my math right. And you can still see this has not changed in configuration at all. So it's been very stable. That's a good thing. We don't want it to all of a sudden create, oh, geez, we just opened something up and now it's eroding away, right? It also hasn't clogged. That's by design. These things are wide and they're shaped like this, right? We fully anticipate this to fully vegetate. It becomes a vegetated swale. So we try to design something that does not clog. And so far it's working. The material, do you guys know can you see where the material that we dug went?
Is it possible that it's right there?
It is possible. It's right there. That's it. So this work is done. Small tracked vehicle. They use swamp mats or timber mats. Every time they advance, they swing around, grab another big piece of timber mat, put it in front. You can't tell there was a machine here. You could hardly tell a week after it was done that there was any presence of a machine. So again, we're trying to be very sensitive to not adding more disturbance to this marsh as we try to restore it. So the concept here is take this material, put it nearby so we don't have to drive it all over the place. Prior to some of this work being done, the requirement in Mass was you have to remove this material out of the marsh completely. But for us, we're like, wait a minute, we need all of this material that we can get to keep the marsh growing in elevation. We don't want to get rid of it. So they get put into these, this is about as big as they get. The machine pushes down these stakes to keep this from floating away. We didn't get to some of these in time over in Newbury. We had a flood tide come in. 5 of the islands just lifted up and floated away. Some of them remained intact after floating 500 feet away. That was amazing. Some of them just completely disintegrated. So our best practice now, as soon as they get done, these stakes go in. But so in 2 years, look at this. I mean, this is completely vegetated in salt marsh grasses. The first year, there was a lot of salicornia. Do you guys know what that is? It's the pickleweed, I think. It turns red. It looks real fleshy in late summer, fall. And that's an early successional. It's a pioneer species. So that was indicating, okay, it's drier. The seeds are here. These plants are pioneering. And within 2 years, you can't find them anymore because they've been outcompeted by the grass we want.
And you're also doing that not only to get rid of the material, but it's also getting flooded so much more frequently. So you give them a little bit of a raised area, and that's an area where they can nest.
Yep. Does everybody know about the salt marsh sparrow story? Okay. Thank you, Peter. I was forgetting that. I don't know why. It's good you're here. Salt marsh sparrow, well named. It's a little sparrow. We all know what sparrows look like. It only lives in salt marshes. So it breeds from southern Maine down to about Maryland, maybe Virginia. And then it winters from, say, New Jersey south to Florida in salt marshes. This bird spends its entire life in salt marshes. And it nests in the highest marsh. So there's actually no habitat here for it. It looks like it could be, but imagine this as a high marsh, right? it's evolved with the tidal cycle. So it needs about 23 to 25 days to lay its egg, its first egg, to where its young can fledge. That's pretty fast, right? You lay the egg and all of a sudden they're flying away, all within 23, 25 days. They're adapted to being flooded a little bit. Like if the nest cup they're nesting on the ground. If the nest cup with the eggs in it floods, the eggs will float. And then when the tide goes out, the eggs drop right back down. Doesn't bother them at all. Mother comes back in, female, incubates them, done. They've evolved by that. If they're chicks, and the same thing happens, and it's a little higher, the chicks can climb out on the grass that's a little higher and wait, survive until the tide goes down. But what's happening is the tides are getting more extreme and more frequent. So the birds aren't getting that 23 to 25 day window where they don't have a major event that washes the eggs out of the nest cup or drowns the chicks. So it looked like it's perfectly good marsh, but it's not for the sparrow. So it's declining by 9% annually. The state listed it 2 years ago as a rare species, so it's protected under the Massachusetts Endangered Species Act. The federal government, I think, is supposed to list it this year. They already kind of punted on it once, but I suspect they're going to list it, so it'll be a federal species. Massachusetts supports 10% of the global population. Great Marsh, 5%. Half of the Massachusetts population is in this marsh. So it's pretty important for this sparrow. And Peter's right. We just wanted to build these up enough to demonstrate that should you get young birds returning that haven't already set up a territory, they may choose this and have a better space.
Is this the appropriate time for a nice summation about where you're at right now? And is that coming?
Are you ready to go?
I'm ready to go.
Oh, no, I mean, are you ready to leave? I got one more thing to show you if you guys have time. And it's right there. Let's go right there. You can kind of see I don't enjoy talking about this. I would love one, but trick is finding the nest. Which occasionally. Absolutely. Yes, coined well. Yes, welcome to the croquet court. Thank you. All right, before I forget, I'm going to talk about... Snuggle up over here so I don't have to yell so much. So I was asked about the seasonality of this work. That is the restoration work that you guys are seeing and experiencing here. So, two things. If the thing that really stops the work from being done if there's a lot of ice on the marsh, well, we don't experience that too much anymore. So that really hasn't been a limiting factor. The other thing that impacts it is how much the marsh is getting flooded. So what cycle are we in that month? We have spring tides that flood the marsh. Those are the highest tides. And then we've got those neap tides, which are the lowest. Most of this work has to take place in the neap tide cycles. The other thing we have to be mindful of is the wildlife. So I talked about the salt marsh sparrow. They breed in June and July. They really kind of start breeding very late May and can go into August. But peak season is really June and July. So we don't do any work in June and July to avoid potentially impacting breeding sparrows. So there's 2 months we don't do this work. Then if you've got, a lot of ice on this marsh, you're not doing the work. If you've got storms that week when you are in the neap tide cycle, when those monthly tides are at their lowest, you don't do work that month. So you can see we start to end up with, and then you need to have, you also need to be thinking of the hours of daylight that you have that coincide with those neap tides if you need to do things like ditch remediation. So we have a very few number of days if the weather is appropriate, where we can do this work on some months, not all of them. So that does slow down the process a lot. But in theory, you can do this work any month of the year if those conditions are right that I talked about. So hopefully that answered that. Unless there was something specific you were thinking about.
What work?
All the work. So whether you're doing...
All the work.
Yes, all the work. So, for example, this is ditch remediation. So that ditch over there has this grass that was cut. This is what you saw. So this was cut last fall. This is exactly what the salt marsh hay, farmers used to do. And then it's a small machine. It's on 2 wheels, walk behind. It's an old-fashioned sickle bar that does this, right? So it doesn't mulch the grass. It cuts the grass at the base, and we have the longest strands as possible. Then a similar machine with a little automated hay rake then moves the cut grass over to the ditch, where it's then tamped down in and secured with the twine and the stakes. You may be able to see some of it. In fact, I can see some right here. This is the twine right here. See, so that was filled in last fall. This is a void where this was naturally remediated. Nature did this, but then we ended up with these voids in here. And if we don't treat those, these end up with, again, an opportunity for the water to remain here at the surface and saturated, and the marsh there and around it is not going to heal very well. And then most of this was brought over to that other ditch over there. So these are going to be taken, these 2 ditches here are being taken out of the flooding and draining process. And it's going to shift to the next one over there, and that one will stay. Yeah. And this was 2 years of treatment. We got 1 more year of treatment, and then we'll look for any spots like this and just do spot treatments. So you now have the full suite of the 3 techniques that we used here.
And when you say we, you're conscripting volunteers to help with that effort.
We are not.
You're not.
I would love to. The challenge with it is we've figured out, in our contractor mostly, this, because of those constraints we just talked about seasonally and monthly, together with the scope of this. Now keep in mind we're now over 1,000 acres. Sometimes we got to move quick. So we've built that automation or semi-automated process into it. You can get way more done with just a crew of 4 people, 1 on each machine and a couple people tamping it in, than you could have with 100 volunteers in one day. And there's less impact on the marsh. So you can imagine if we're all out here trying to, so the alternatives without that mechanization is, okay, you got to figure out how to cut it. Then how do you get the grass that you cut into the ditch? Got a lot of people either with rakes, or at one time they were leaf blowers. I've seen both, and I can tell you this process is a lot less impactful in terms of negative impact on the marsh. So I would love to be able to put crews of volunteers out here, but it's easier and faster and more economical for us to do it with just smaller crews with the right tools. Yeah. It's a good question, though.
Is that runnel over there, is that the single runnel that's draining that whole area?
Yes.
There's only, okay.
Only one.
Could you list the 3 methods for me?
Yes. So ditch remediation, which is what we're standing in right here, where the grass is cut and moved into the ditch to rebuild the peat. To reduce oxidation, that's what that whole point is. Then there's the runneling, which was behind us. That's to lower the surface water, that groundwater that's being expressed at the surface that kills the grass. And then the nesting islands, it's where we use the material that's excavated from the runnel to create these future breeding habitats for sparrows and keeping the sediment in the system. Yeah. And those 3 techniques we're combining to do thousands of acres. So the Trustees is doing 3 phases on roughly 1,300 acres. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service up at Parker River National Wildlife Refuge, they have completed just over 100 acres. They're just about to receive permitting for 1,400 acres. And then we have our last, about 1,000 acres that we have right behind them. The state, so Mass Wildlife, has completed restoration designs like I showed you all on 5,000 acres.
Who's funding this work?
There's our 8,000 acres. So that's the easy part. After that, and I'll answer that question right in a minute, but the next step beyond those 5,000 acres is a lot of smaller parcels that are privately owned. It's going to be a lot of work, a lot of cost to bundle those to get the work done. Because you go to permit that, say you permit a 50-acre marsh in Ipswich versus a 500-acre marsh, the permitting is going to be the same cost, believe it or not. And the implementation is not the expensive part. Monitoring is much more expensive than the implementation. So now you begin to see you'd have to bundle those to make it reasonable.
So there's a third area of work, monitoring.
Yeah.
Which you explain with the photos and...
Right. So we're measuring...
Measuring the aggregation.
We're measuring groundwater, we're measuring surface water, the residency time, we're measuring the vegetation and the depth within these treated ditches, salt marsh breeding birds. We're monitoring mosquitoes in some cases because we knew what was coming. If you're filling in the ditches, aren't you going to create more mosquitoes? In fact, we're not. And the district, the mosquito control district, felt so strongly that they agreed with us. They're helping us monitor for the mosquitoes in that. Yeah, no, that's the exciting part about this, the partnership. Everyone's on the same page and we're scaling up.
Who's everyone?
U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the state of Massachusetts, primarily the Division of Fish and Wildlife, Trustees, Essex County Greenbelt, Mass Audubon, the towns, Essex. Peter, where did you go? I mean, Essex is tremendously involved in this and supporting. Ipswich as well. We haven't even talked about raising of Argilla Road, and I wasn't going to. But I mean, that's flooding now, and all the daylight flooding that's happening, right? If you want to get to the beach on some days, it's very hard now. And that's just going to get worse. But so in partnership with the town of Ipswich, we're putting for a lot of grants. I still haven't forgot that question about funding. And trying to figure out how we can make a design that's going to be acceptable through the permitting process to elevate that road while still being nature-based and green as we do it. That's been going at least 3 years, and I'm not sure we have a plan yet. So this work is challenging. And it's going to happen over the entire coast, not just here, not just in the Great Marsh, but everywhere along the coast. So funding-wise, yes, this has taken a lot of different funders. We started with a $16,000 grant from Mass Bays. Remember meeting Peter, and I forget the other, what was her name? Preseda, I think, right? Yeah, Preseda, thank you. In Boston, we got $16,000. We said we're going to do a design and permitting for our first phase. That's the 85 acres up in Newbury. And we've ended with a $1 million grant from the NARCA program that required a $2 million match for phase 3. Greenbelt and the trustees, through each donating conservation restrictions to the other. So we're trying to be very creative on this, lower the cost. We have to. There's not enough money out there to do this if we can't figure out how to be more efficient and lower those per acre costs. That gets back to the volunteerism thing again.
What's the ultimate, what's your wish, your Christmas wish? What would the ultimate be here? Like restoration back before we did all this?
No, not quite, because we can't get, there's no way to go back to what was here prior to all this ditching. So the Christmas present for me, I guess, would be that there has been enough intervention using nature-based techniques that we have a marsh, the most of the Great Marsh, I'm sure we're going to lose some of it, is able to keep pace with sea level rise at least for the next 100 years, and we don't lose it.
So in order to do that, you had to restore the ecosystem.
Hydrology. It all comes down to hydrology.
Right. Is the ecosystem collapsed? No, not quite.
Oh no, it's far from collapsed at this point. Yeah. If you're a salt marsh sparrow, you're getting worried.
Yeah.
If you're a soft shell clam, you're probably going, I got some habitat coming my way. Yeah. There's going to be winners and losers, but I mean, right now the salt marsh, the Great Marsh is about 80% high marsh, 20% low marsh, and by 2070 that's going to flip if we don't get to doing enough of this work fast enough. So you'll have low marsh on 80% and high marsh will only be 20%. Now, that's what the models tell us. And so far the models are tracking pretty good, if not on the low end of things. So, you know, there's reason to believe that that's a reasonable outcome by 2070. Yeah, but we're not going to accept it. Right? We're going to do what we can with our partners. We think we have a fighting chance here.
Russ, this is a sidebar. Greenheads, mosquitoes, and ticks. How do they survive, or what's their future in this Great Marsh?
Okay, no ticks in the salt marsh. I've never encountered a tick. Has anybody here encountered a tick? No. Yeah. No. No. Now, mosquitoes, as you know, and greenheads are a totally different thing. With restoration, mosquitoes have evolved to be, you know, salt marsh breed. There's more than just the salt marsh mosquito that will breed in salt marshes, but that is the big one. That's what gives everybody heart palpitations when you get the swarms, you know, those age classes, and they can go 10 miles inland. They're fast. But again, they will be here, but hopefully in less, certainly no more as we do this restoration. Where you don't have standing water, you don't have salt marsh breeding habit, a mosquito breeding habitat. Where you have standing water, you have that potential, especially without fish. Greenheads, I don't know enough about greenheads. I'm sorry, I just don't. It is a predatory animal, unlike the mosquitoes. They're looking for blood. Only the females. The males don't. I mean, yeah, the males don't. They're going off looking for pollen or something else. They don't bite you. Greenheads, the larvae, they're very predaceous, so they're attacking other things, invertebrates in the ecosystem. You just know everything I know about greenheads.
Boxes actually serve a function?
Oh yeah, they're attracted to heat. So the beauty about those boxes is they're dark. They have screens on top. With some models, the older models anyways, and they go in underneath because it's heat and dark, and they think the way out is through the screen, but they can't get through it. They never think about going down. And they just die.
I heard that they resemble cows underneath, which they love, the black boxes.
I have not heard that.
There's a visual that resembles the cow.
Okay. I'm all for it. If that's what they think it is and they go in there. Yeah. But, you know, I mean, it doesn't eliminate them. It doesn't eliminate the greenhead, but I think it makes it much less intolerable. The work I do out here all season long, I never have a problem with greenheads. I see them, and there's a few of them that land on me, but they don't, I don't know, they're not biting me out here. Of course they do. You go out on the beach and you lay out on the beach, they're going to find you. Yeah. The other thing that's funny to look at, if you go up to those boxes sometimes and you'll see they're just covered with bird poop. The birds want to get them, but they can't. Must be frustrating for those birds.
When I lived in Marshfield, they always told me that the ditches were Army Corps of Engineers.
I have not heard that.
To get rid of the mosquitoes and all
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. There is some variation by town and by region. But I have not heard that one. It was usually mosquito control districts.
By the district.
Right. And,
WPA program.
WPA.
Yeah, back in the third.
right.
And maybe the Army Corps was involved.
Right.
Could have been. Yeah, have you heard that though? I've never heard Army Corps. Yeah. Doesn't surprise me that they'd be in on it. Consulted maybe. Yeah.
All right, so give us the state of the union for the marsh here. Where are we now?
Well, like I said, this is phase 2. This year will be phase 3. We'll be implementing, hopefully if we get our permitting, our project, our large-scale project at 1,000 acres will start in the spring of 2025.
And where were we? Was it bad when you started? How bad was it when you started?
Well, you won't notice a tremendous difference because, like I said, we're moving at the speed of nature. The monitoring is telling us where we have 3 years of ditch remediation, the marsh in that vicinity is staying wetter longer. That's good. That means it's not oxidizing. So we've stopped it from sinking at those locations. And where we have the monitoring around the runnels, it's telling us that that groundwater has subsided and we're seeing more vegetation growing back where there was none and stronger vegetation where there was some. So it's all moving in the right direction. And when we're done, say after 3 years and then some spot treatment maybe in year 4, the marsh is still going to take many years to adjust to its new hydrology to where it can then be, all right, we're back on track, and it's utilizing all that vegetation growth to its maximum, as well as receiving the sediment that is in the system to build in elevation and keep pace with sea level rise. Only time will tell. The second story to this, or the next chapter, has not been written yet, but we're thinking about it. I say we, practitioners and regulators along the coast, what if it doesn't work? Well, it's probably because there's not enough sediment in the system, right? We need a little more sediment in here to work together with those grasses. Right now, that's almost impossible to do in Massachusetts under the regulatory framework. It's changing. But I don't think we started too late. By the time we know we need that, there will be resolution on that. What I'm hoping for is, instead of having, like they do down south, you'll get these dredges that will come in and they'll just throw tons of material or spray it out onto the marshes. That is an option, but you have to keep doing that. That's a Band-Aid. Unless you fix the hydrology, you're just waiting for the next 3 years or whatever, and that's like, okay, now we got to put more on there. So we may need to do that in addition to fixing the hydrology. I'm hoping for more precise, targeted introduction of sediment at erosion points within the marsh, and then let the marsh in the tide, that whole tide cycle, deliver the sediment where it needs to go. Much like we're doing, we're tweaking the existing infrastructure that's been here for hundreds of years to let the natural process do the heavy lifting of building in elevation. I want to see the marsh and the tides do the heavy lifting at delivering the sediment. So we've started to do those things. Mass CZM is already working on a project down at Wacoit Bay on the Cape. They're modeling this last point that I just talked about, a very precise introduction of sediment into the system and letting the currents deliver it as sediment onto the marsh platform. Yeah, but it's all modeling. The next phase, it's all modeling. The next phase would be actually doing something to test that. We've opened the door here. We said, look, trustees would certainly host those scale, even small scale, in the field tests on that. But what I want to have some of those tools ready in the toolbox if we need them. I don't want to wait to discover, oh, we need those. All right, now let's take a 10-year process, effort to figure out what's right. How do we get it through the permitting system? So we need to be thinking about the next step and what tools we may need in the toolbox so we don't lose time.
Is there anything that people or the community can do to help?
Yeah, support the work, support any regulatory changes. We're not saying get rid of regulations. Those have to be there. We have what we have because we had good regulations. It's just nobody anticipated, oh, we're going to have to do this restoration and we have sea level rise coming. I think at towns, a lot of these towns have, well, Peter, you'd be a good one to answer this too, but a lot of these towns have these coastal vulnerability plans that they've done, the MVP. And, you get to the end of that and you have these, hey, here's things we want to do. Some of them you can, but some you can't do. So I think Essex is going to be, sharing some updates on theirs coming rather soon. That's awesome. At that coastal community level, to keep updating their plans involving the community, making sure that Conscom and Planning Board and Zoning Board is working with the major landowners and looking for those grants, looking for that innovation, and keep moving this forward. It's the best that I think we can do.
Awareness.
Yeah.
Can I just ask a question back to the ditches? I don't know if I understood this right, but are you saying the most damaging aspect of the ditches is the fact that they expose more of the peat to oxygen and then cause the breakdown in the sinking of the level of the
Yes,
marsh?
at the localized level. Yeah, you can almost see that in some of them. Like if you look at this ditch over here, you see the marsh grade off down towards it. Right. So if you looked at it at a nice, plane, it would go whoop, whoop like that.
Continually letting more oxygen
Right. And then what happens is if there may have been one main creek here that drained this area. What the farmers did is they fractured that and they put in, say, 3 or 4. So now when the tide comes in, that tide's coming in 4 pathways instead of 1. So there's not as much energy behind that water to keep any of them clear of sediment. And that's what's happening. Then you see the sediment dropping out all over the place in all of them, and it's obstructing the ability for the water to get off of the marsh when it needs to.
So yeah, just the hydrology is all.
Hydrology is completely, we know how they did it, we're just reversing it. And it's going to take, they did it over hundreds of years, we're going to try to do it in 5 to 10 for any of these projects. But yeah, so then you're back to one primary channel that's servicing a given area of marsh. So now you have enough flow and velocity with those tides, maybe not every tide, but enough of them, that it keeps that clean and pushes the sediment up onto the marsh where it's needed to help build elevation. Yeah. So I would say don't even bother doing other techniques until you fix the hydrology. And I'll tell you, I was down, I don't know if you guys heard me, on Wednesday I was down at Mattapoisett on the south coast. Their marshes are in much more dire need. They have a lower tidal range, and they also have, like when the marsh gets saturated, like I was showing you, it turns over to the low form alternative flora and there's standing water. Crabs are moving in and eating the trajectory of the climate. We're going to see that in the next 10 years. So the faster we can get a healthy marsh, the better off we'll be able to minimize that impact of crab herbivory.
Is that fiddler crabs?
Fiddler crabs and purple marsh crabs. Yep. Yeah, we have, exactly. It took me a while to find them, but they're in all of these ditches. If you're patient enough, you can find them clinging on to the side of these ditches. That's the fiddler crab. They're the ones with the giant arm on one side and the small one on the other. But yeah, and they burrow holes in at extreme densities, like I've seen down in the Cape and in the South Coast. It looks like someone just shot the marsh with buckshot. It's just full of holes, thousands and thousands of holes. Yeah, and of course they're eating the vegetation in some cases. It's a double whammy. We're not there yet, thank God. So we have a good marsh that we're going to make better and keep it good. Final words.
Thank you.
And nobody got wet yet. Happy to answer questions on the way back.